Statistically, it's very rare for people who had gone missing to be found healthy and unharmed after a certain amount of time. Some of these individuals were lucky to have been found, and their cases were ultimately solved. Number 5. In 2002, after finishing her performance at the San Rafael Theater, Laura Zapata and Ernestina Sodi, a former Miss Mexico City, joined outside. Zapata and Sodi are both sisters to the Mexican superstar Thalia. According to witnesses, there was a man who stalked Zapata after her show and stated that the two girls were forced into two separate cars by hooded men, carrying hammers after smashing the windows of the car that the two were traveling in. The two disappeared 5 blocks away from the theater, and the car they'd traveled in was found abandoned. While this had been a shocking event, it was not particularly new. Kidnapping had been on the rise in Mexico at the time. It was later discovered that the kidnappers had held the two sisters captive for ransom. The other relatives that were closely involved stated that they didn't want law enforcement involved, and so it was assumed that they agreed to pay the ransom. Zapata later shared that they'd been kidnapped in order for the gang to extort money from Tommy Mottola, Thalia's husband, who was a music producer. They had told Zapata and Sodi that the abduction was nothing personal, but that they wanted money from Mottola, $1 million to be exact. Zapata didn't know how to speak a lot of English, but explained to the abductors that she didn't believe that her sister and family had that much money, and she expressed that they may not even spend it on her. A lengthy 18 days after the initial kidnapping, Zapata was released. Unfortunately, Sodi was kept for another 16 days, over a month after she'd been taken. She was released on the 34th day unharmed. Zapata stated that her sister, Thalia, and her husband did not pay the ransom that was being demanded, and it remains unconfirmed if any ransom was paid at all. In an interview, the actress was asked if Mottola aided in resolving the case, to which she responded that he did not participate, and the whole ordeal had been strictly a family matter. Thalia had been in Mexico after the abduction had taken place, but didn't wish to speak to the media or law enforcement. In April of 2003, 3 individuals had been arrested on suspicion of abducting Laura Zapata and Ernestina Sodi. The perpetrators were apprehended after kidnapping a textile businessman who was locked up in a house in Mexico City. The abductors were then able to gather a sum of $5 million. It was stated that another 2 members belonging to the alleged kidnapping gang had been apprehended in January. So far, there have been 5 members in the group. Later, the gang leader, Mario Alberto Bayardo, along with 2 other members, were also arrested. Officials believe that it had been this gang behind the kidnapping of the sisters, Zapata and Sodi. However, the family did not press charges against the men regarding the abductions that they allegedly carried out. The family had also relied on the assistance of a private team that handled negotiations between them and the gang. Not much commentary on the incident came from Sodi, and Zapata took the lead in most of the conversations on the incident. She stated that it had taken her 6 years to overcome the ordeal, and had to go through the process of picking up each piece and rearranging her life. She explained in an interview that she did try to run, but they managed to grab her and placed her inside of a vehicle. They then did the same to Sodi, but then later moved her to the trunk of another car. Once arriving at the first place, Zapata had begun to yell angrily at them, and one of the members hushed her and told her to calm down, and that if she hadn't, then he would have gotten angry as well. Luckily, both women were released unharmed from such a terrifying ordeal. This is often not the case with these kinds of situations. Zapata later ran for Congress and said that the kidnapping made her feel as though she wanted to help in how Mexican laws and politics are shaped. Ernestina Sodi is an accomplished writer now, and she's released a few books, while her sister had acted, sang, and danced in many performances. The two are glad to be able to continue their lives after this incident has occurred. Number 4. In February of 2002, Ingrid Betancourt had been kidnapped and lived the next 6.5 years in captivity. Betancourt was a presidential candidate who was leading Colombia's Green Party. She was supposed to make the journey to a secluded community, and she unfortunately lost her place on a military helicopter at the last minute. Instead, Betancourt had to drive. During this time, Colombian kidnappings were on the rise, and a radio station was dedicated to messages of those who had gone missing. In later interviews, Betancourt explained that she'd come to the roadblock where officials were investigating vehicles. She had looked at the shoes of the individuals stopping her. Members of the FARC wore rubber boots, whereas the military wore leather. The officials wore rubber, and that's how she knew she was in danger. Betancourt found herself being abducted by the FARC, Colombia's Revolutionary Armed Forces, where she was kept captive in the jungle in an isolated area. She was mistreated and not given access to a lot of food, and occasionally she would have a firearm pointed at her temple. She would need to find a way to survive both mentally and physically. She strategized a coping mechanism which she called rebooting the mind. Betancourt would focus on basic things such as breathing, eating, and sleeping. Betancourt's husband, Juan Carlos Lecomte, stated that he would be visiting these villages in search of clues of his missing wife. He also expressed that he wanted to talk to the people and figure out whether or not she was still alive, or what her health was like. He claimed to not be in contact with any of the individuals who were holding her hostage, though. Some sightings of Betancourt did come up, but they'd been left unconfirmed. According to hostages who'd been kept with Betancourt, they believed she was suffering from depression. Her ex-husband stated that they believed that she was suffering from liver problems and appeared to be extremely weak. Chances of Betancourt being released seemed slimmer after the leaders of the Revolutionary Armed Forces had declined to have her medically treated through a mission led by France, with the inclusion of Spain as well as Switzerland. The mission would have carried out a treatment and rescue plan for the presidential candidate. She expressed that the jungle was a prison that was impossible to escape, even though she had made multiple attempts. After her third attempt, she was forced to wear a chain around her neck. To make it even more difficult for rescuers to track missing individuals, FARC would move their captives around the jungle. The French jet that was in charge of the medical mission had landed in Colombia, and soon after, a statement had been posted on the internet by FARC, which stated that they would not release hostages unless it was in exchange for rebels that were imprisoned in Colombia and the US. This, of course, wouldn't happen. In July of 2008, a helicopter transporting over a dozen commandos had landed in the southern Colombian jungles. A rather risky rescue mission ensued from there. The military officials disguised themselves as journalists or humanitarian aid workers as they set out to rescue many hostages who were being held captive by the Marxist-Leninist guerrillas. The FARC group had happily greeted the helicopter after assuming that it was there to transfer those who had been kidnapped to a different camp. Once the helicopter was back in the air, the officials were able to disarm Gerardo Ramirez, who was the leader of FARC, and his bodyguard, who had both gotten into the helicopter to accompany the captives. The rescue mission was a success and took less than half an hour, and it was done without any violence. The mission was named Operation Jacques, which led to the release of the presidential candidate as well as many others. The Spy Museum exhibition holds the radio and pieces of clothing that were used by the mission leading to the release of captives. These, along with various props, were used in order to trick the FARC. Such items include a shirt as well as a vest that had the emblem of a fake humanitarian mission. A helmet was also decorated with a red and white design. The officials had to act the part as well as look like they were part of FARC if the mission were to be successful. Betancourt explained that once the helicopter was in the air, something had started to happen. She stated that the commander, who was present during 4 of the years of her abduction, who was incredibly cruel towards her, and the other captives, was now on the floor with his eyes bound, and the captives were finally free. Number 3. A 23-year-old woman from Loveland, Ohio, had gone missing on the 11th of June in 2022. Alicia Kenny decided to go on a nature walk during the evening and left her Loveland home where she lived with her grandparents. The house was close to Lebanon Road, and Kenny was known to go to parks in the area. She was described as a religious woman who always carried a Bible in her backpack. After she left that evening, Kenny didn't return home, causing her family to panic. The following day, on the 12th of June, the backpack was discovered by a delivery driver in a subdivision of Loveland that was left undisclosed. Inside of it, they found the Bible that was mentioned previously, as well as her phone and wallet. The family became more fearful when authorities turned up with the woman's backpack. A missing person report was then filed. An investigation was carried out which turned up leads such as Kenny calling people for a ride from Loveland. She, however, was not picked up by anyone she knew. The next morning, she was reportedly seen in the early hours on Madeira Road in Sims Township. A description of the woman was released detailing her as Caucasian with brown hair and eyes. It was stated that she was wearing a white shirt, dark pants, and sandals at the time of her disappearance. A few days later, in the afternoon of the 15th of June in 2022, Alicia Kenny was found safe and unharmed. Resources such as DNA samples and agents were provided by the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, as well as the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office. Law enforcement had to investigate this case through challenging weather and worked long hours under other harsh conditions. Marcy Kenny, Alicia Kenny's mother, had stated that her daughter would often go to the park to draw or write, and stated that they couldn't think of any reason that Kenny would put her backpack down and just walk away. Marcy and church members searched the area where Kenny was reportedly last seen, and began hanging missing person posters around there. One of Kenny's friends had posted pictures of her tattoos on social media to make it easier to identify her. After she was discovered, she was placed into the care of her family members. It was not disclosed exactly how she was found, but a statement was released saying Alicia had been found safe after needing a couple of days to clear her head. Although this statement leads to more questions, at least the woman was found safe and is now back at home with her family. Number 2. In 2019, Jayme Closs, a Wisconsin girl of 13 years old, disappeared after fleeing from her home. She discovered her parents fatally wounded and ran off on foot. She was not seen for 3 months after this. On this day, authorities had been alerted to the Closs family home in Barron, which is 75 miles north of Minneapolis. There, they discovered the victims but could not find Jayme or the attacker. Tips and surveillance videos were pursued and various searches took place, involving 2,000 volunteers. Other areas were informed of the disappearance, and law enforcement was instructed to keep an eye out for the girl. While a woman, Jeanne Nutter, was walking her dog in Douglas County, Jayme emerged from the woods and ran up to her to ask for help. The woman began to pound on a neighbor's door. Kristen and Peter Kazinskas stated that when they came to the door, they found a skinny, dirty-looking child with one of the neighbors, shouting, "This is Jayme Closs, call 911. Kristen explained that the girl did not appear to be afraid that anyone was coming after her, and tried to make her as comfortable as possible while they waited for the police. Jayme refused to eat or drink during this time. She'd given Kristen a few details and spoke of being locked up or hidden when her alleged abductor had to leave. Only 10 minutes after Jayme had been attended to by police officers, the suspect was taken into custody. It was detailed that the girl had escaped a remote house where her captor had kept her. The house was also found in a secluded community near Gordon. The suspect was Jake Thomas Patterson, who was 21 years old at the time. It's believed that the offender had calculated his steps and had kept himself from being seen. He'd been discovered just down the road from the house where Jayme was being held captive and was apprehended with the use of a vehicle description. Jayme Closs was released into the custody of an aunt, Jennifer Smith, after being examined at the hospital. Patterson, the offender, had no criminal record, which left even more of a mystery. It was uncertain as to what the motive was behind the kidnapping and the homicides. Another question had been left unanswered as well, which asked how it was possible for Jayme to have been kept at this house for 3 months without a single person seeing her. Authorities have found no connection between Patterson and the family that he offended. It was later discovered that he'd worked at the same turkey plant as Jayme's parents at one point. The parents had been working there for years before the incident. There was also no evidence of contact between Patterson, the Closs family, or their daughter. The community in which Jayme was being kept had no idea that she was there, and those who resided there were shocked to learn that the missing girl had been among them for 3 months of her abduction. Some residents of the community expressed that they believed that the secluded area of the northwestern region of Wisconsin would be perfect to keep Jayme out of sight, since there are lakeside cabins as well as ATV trails in the area. One resident, Dolly McNamara, explained that when others have left, they would watch over their cabins. They would look out for one another. She said that everyone keeps an eye out, and that was just not enough. Some of these residents claimed they never knew Patterson either, despite the fact that he'd been living there for a few years. The offender was also unemployed at the time. A neighbor had stated in an interview that Patterson and his brother grew up in that house, which indicated that the parents had moved out while the two continued to reside there. She stated that the neighbors would have some issues with the boys, such as siphoning gas. There are no additional suspects for this particular case, aside from Jake Patterson, who faced formal charges after his arrest. 3 months of being missing can be a detrimental amount of time. Luckily, this girl was kept alive during it all and managed to escape. Even though there are other unfortunate circumstances involved in the case, it relieved many of the residents and family that Jayme Closs was found alive and well, despite some malnourishment and shock. Number 1. In the early morning hours on the 5th of June in 2002 in Salt Lake City, Utah, Mary Catherine Smart had suddenly woken up to the sound of a voice belonging to a male. Mary was in the same room that she shared with 2 older sisters. She could hear the voice threatening one of her sisters, and so she acted as though she was asleep. In a matter of moments, her older sister Elizabeth had disappeared. She'd heard the man tell Elizabeth that she had to be quiet or he would harm her family. Hours later, Mary had woken her parents to tell them what had happened. Ed and Lois Smart initially thought that young Mary had a bad dream, but after searching the house and not finding their daughter, they began to panic, and they phoned the authorities 1 hour later, and a stressful search for the girl began. The first search was of the house, and it was found that the kidnapper had come through an unlocked window situated in the kitchen. Authorities used search dogs to track Elizabeth's scent, which ended a few feet away from the house. The kidnapping was soon posted all over social media. The family computer was searched to see if Elizabeth had made contact with any strangers online, but nothing came up regarding that. It was discovered that the family home was undergoing some renovations in preparation for selling. The investigators listed everyone involved in these renovations, including repairmen, real estate professionals, contractors, and so on. They took to interviewing them, and to speed up the process, the family offered a $250,000 reward for anyone who could provide the necessary information. When the investigation continued, Elizabeth was being taken into a campsite in a nearby forest by her kidnapper, who was identified as Brian David Mitchell. Along with him was his wife, Wanda Barzee, who was also involved in the crime. Elizabeth was made to change into a white robe to match their clothing, and was then tied to a tree. Mitchell strongly believed that he was a prophet of God and had convinced the girl that if she tried to escape, then he would harm her family. He planned to take her as a second wife, which would be in accordance with the banned tradition that he still followed. The 2 abductors would even take Elizabeth out in public, but she was hidden with a veil and robes to ensure that no one was able to identify her. A few suspects were placed on the list and were investigated over the next few months. None of them fit in with Mary's descriptions, however. 4 months into the kidnapping, Mary had an epiphany and stated that she believed the kidnapper was a homeless man who had worked on the house before the kidnapping. The family unfortunately didn't know his name or anything else about him, aside from the fact that he preached to other homeless people. The family decided to take matters into their own hands and contacted John Walsh, who had shown sketches on his show America's Most Wanted, as described by Mary, of a man they referred to as Emmanuel. One viewer was Wanda Barzee's son, Derek Thompson, and Mitchell's ex-wife, who also had seen the show and called the police. She told authorities that if he had the girl, then he would be keeping her alive for a reason. Mitchell was beginning to be identified by this time, and he had moved the 2 to California, where he found another young girl who he also wanted to marry. He tried to kidnap this girl as well, but failed, and a few weeks later he was arrested for breaking into a preschool, but gave a false name to authorities. He was held in prison until a hearing was held. Wanda became concerned and left Elizabeth alone to go and search for her husband. America's Most Wanted then revealed some images of the man that had been sent in by his son. and one viewer recognized him and called the authorities. She expressed that she saw a similar-looking man who was walking with two veiled women. Wanda and Mitchell realized that they were being looked for, and so the robes were abandoned. A number of reports and sightings came through from California, but by the time investigators arrived, they were long gone. On the 12th of March 2003, the three had arrived in Utah, and authorities were contacted immediately. They took Elizabeth away from the captors and questioned her. She maintained that she was not Elizabeth Smart and had been traveling out of her own will with the two. She finally admitted her identity when she was questioned further. That same day, Ed was told that he needed to go to the police station. When he arrived, he didn't expect to find his long-lost daughter, and he was thrilled. Mitchell was sentenced to 15 years in prison in 2009, and in 2010 he was ruled competent enough to stand trial after being suspected of a mental disorder. From there, he was sentenced to life in prison. On the 20-year anniversary of her rescue, Elizabeth states that she's no longer afraid, and she's become an advocate for missing children and is a child safety activist. If it was not for the show that displayed the sketches of the man that Mary detailed, then perhaps Elizabeth would have never been rescued, and her abductors would have never been brought to justice. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.